Well, here we are. Small subject today. The role of the sovereign nation state in Australia in 2025. Yes, I was being satirical. Look, the sovereign nation state is a concept which now dominates all activity on planet Earth. We have minuscule states and states that encompass over 1/5 of the Earth's surface. Each of them is theoretically independent. We have nation states which can be described as dictatorships, one-party states, multi-party parliamentary democracies, monarchies. Yes, we even have monarchies in the 21st century. Now, the nation state is a little bit like the air we breathe. It's all around us. It's there all the time. Irrespective of where you find yourself on the planet, you are in a sovereign nation state, whether as a citizen, a resident, a guest, a tourist. So what's the role of the state in Australia in the 21st century? Now, Australia is a multi-party parliamentary democracy. The state is based on a number of principles and institutions. You've got the Constitution, which determines the type of legislation which can be passed by Parliament. You've got the common law, which is a law which is amassed over decades by judicial judgments. But ultimately, it's the constitutional arrangements which determine the law. But the problem becomes a little bit more blurred, a little bit more complex when we deal with the realities. Now, historically, the nation state was created to keep those in power and to ensure the status quo continued ad infinitum. Obviously, the religious element was important, as many rulers claimed they had a divine right to rule and impose their will on the population. It wasn't until a few centuries ago that we saw a change in the significance and the role of the nation state. And slowly, through revolutions and reforms and revolts and armed struggle, the nation state was forced to take on the interests of the many, the public, before the interests of the few. Now, unfortunately in Australia, our constitutional arrangements have no significant protection for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. That means that any political party or a coalition of political parties, a majority in the both houses of Parliament, can ultimately pass any legislation they like. And we've seen this over the last century. We've seen legislation which was passed under the War Precautions Act. We've seen legislation which has been passed under the so-called Anti-Terrorist Act. which highlights the individual has no protection against the exercise of state power. But the state is more than that. It's this air we breathe. It taxes people. It creates laws. It creates institutions. The ultimate irony is that theoretically the state is there to maintain control for a minority, but somehow presents itself as the protector of public good, as the entity which protects us from both internal division and chaos and external aggression. And as I said previously, the role of the state has been modified, mainly in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, through revolutionary movements which have attempted to force the state to take the interests of the many, that's the public, before the interests of the few, those who wield power and concentrate power in their hands. So how has the Australian state fared in terms of providing stability and security for the people who live in its sovereign borders? How has it fared? Because that is the only way you can judge it. And what will happen if people challenge the integrity of the state and force it to put the interests of the many, the public, before the interests of the few? Now in Australia, at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, we still live in a multi-parliamentary democracy. We still have a system which allows Parliament to overrule the common law. We still find ourselves in a situation where the individual has no protection against the arbitrary exercise of state power. But there have been enormous changes in the last 50 years, not just in the terms of our individual role in the state, but in terms of the fact that more and more and more citizens and permanent residents believe that the state is the only thing that protects them from chaos. So let's look at the Australia in the 21st century. We are a colonial entity. We were created through the violent dispossession and continued dispossession of this country's First Nations people. That's our history. That's how we began. Federation occurred when 6 independent colonies under British rule, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia and West Australia, through a series of conferences and referendums at the state level, decided to federate and form one unified sovereign nation state in 1901. The dilemma for the people who founded this country's constitution was that each state had a varying population, each state had varying resources, and in order for state citizens to vote for federation, they had to ensure that the colonies, the richer colonies, made some allowances for poorer colonies, and that's why we have the concept of the House of Representatives, but more importantly the Senate, where each state has an equal representation in Parliament. So this is the dilemma. Is it a dilemma? Have we moved forward? Has anything ultimately changed? Now obviously this country's history is replete with examples of people fighting for reform, and in some cases revolutionary change. And it's these struggles which occurred from the 1850s to about the Second World War, and some after the Second World War, which forced the state to take on an increasing responsibility from its historic role as the organism which regulated people's behaviour through its absolute control of the disciplinary arm of the state, the police and the armed forces. That's what allows the state to continue in its current form. But through protests, through reform movements, through parliamentary change, we saw a dilution, not of the power of the state, but a dilution of the power of the elements in society which see the state as their entity, as their property. And that's the central dilemma. Does the state, the sovereign nation state, look after the interests of the whole population, or is the sovereign nation state in this country nothing more than a protection racket that protects? Those are the central questions. Does the sovereign nation state in Australia protect and extend the interests of the public, the majority, against the increasing power that is exercised through corporations and individuals who have amassed extraordinary amounts of wealth because of the type of economic system which dominates us in this country? Obviously, we are part of a private investment for private profit network which straddles the world. But what we've seen over the last 50 years during the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation and globalisation revolution that has swept the world, what we have seen is the hard-earned gains which have been made by generations of Australian workers post-Federation have been lost. So what we are seeing in the 21st century, at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century, we are seeing an increasing concentration of power and wealth in a minuscule minority. And in this increasing concentration of power and wealth has resulted in increased inequality. It has resulted in the passage of legislation which limits freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom of association in this country, because there are no constitutional protections for the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. And every time sections of society organise in order to ensure that public interests come before corporate interests, we see the introduction of more and more and more laws at the state and federal level which limit the possibility for change. We live in a country where it's illegal to take strike action outside enterprising bargaining agreement period. We live in a country where collective bargaining is impossible. We live in a country where a worker can be fined $10,000 a day for striking outside an enterprise bargaining agreement period. We live in a country where the power of the trade unions have been diluted to such an extent they no longer pose a threat to the corporate sector. We live in a country where we see calls every day for the limitation of freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest, because there is no constitutional protections for us in Australia. And I can assure you that if there was a significant movement for change, that the minister that's responsible for Home Affairs would ban that movement, because under current legislation, because we have no constitutional protections, the minister responsible for Home Affairs, previously it was the Attorney General, could ban any organisation at any time without recourse to appeal, because they believe they may pose a threat to Commonwealth property or power. So that's the situation at the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. We have a state which has become much more powerful because of the concentration of power, not in the hands of parliamentarians, but in the hands of a minuscule minority that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, whose power is so extraordinary, they, through the media, both the legacy media and social media, through pressure on political parties, through manipulation of political parties, through pressure on governments, can and do determine parliamentary legislation. If this hadn't occurred, why would we have 1/3 of the population living a hand-to-mouth existence on social security benefits? Why would over 2.5 million children be living in poverty in this resource-rich country? Why would 80 to 90% of the population be working a lifetime in order to keep a roof over their head, whether it's rent or paying off a mortgage? We have reached a situation where the state no longer is the organ which looks after the interests of the many, the public. It is an organ which looks after the interests of the few through the manipulation of the parliamentary process, through manipulation of legislation, through the passage of legislation which reinforces their power and wealth at the expense of each and all of us. So if you want to challenge this, I implore you, ask you, to look at the Public Interest Before Corporate Interest website, pipsy.net. And if you're interested in joining the struggle to ensure that public interests are put before the corporate interests, well then, join us.